Thank you very much, dear Deputy Minister, dear colleagues. I will try also to give a comprehensive and broad picture of codification, but this time in East Central Europe, this region, because this region has also a very interesting and complex history of codification. And for maybe scientific or more or less didactic purposes, I identified during my research 5 waves of codification. But these 5 waves of codification does not mean that other type of typology are not perfectly correct, because identifying these 5 ways is based maybe on a historical context, ideas and currents, not on the concrete codes, explaining much more the context of the codes, not the codes themselves. So the first encounters with this modern term civil codes in this region were direct enactments of Western codes, and practically that happened in the case of the Austrian Civil Code, which was enacted in the Czech territories or parts of the present-day Croatia and in Slovenia. And this is the first time that a modern type code entered into force. But also, for a short time, the French code was in force in parts of Slovenia and present-day Croatia, because during the Napoleonic Wars, there were formed the so-called Illyrian provinces, and General Auguste de Mormont put in force the French code for a relatively short period. So these were the first encounters when civil code in modern sense was applied in this area. And the next move comes from the eastern part of this region, today part of Romania. At that time, it was a state called Moldova, but which was practically part of the Ottoman Empire, and the battlefield, permanent battlefield between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. And this is Moldova, and in 1817, Greek ruler Scarlat Kalimach prepared a first civil code, which is not a direct enactment of a foreign code, and this code is a very strange fusion between Western and Eastern traditions, because has a lot of Byzantine elements, but basically most of the private law is based on the Austrian code, and it's strangely the ruler, as I said, it was a Greek prince coming from the Fener district of Istanbul and nominated by the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. But they opted for an Austrian model due to the fact that the main lawyer of the prince was a lawyer from Transylvania who studied in Vienna, and practically he brought with him the ideas of the Austrian code, and this is why Greek language code was prepared in 1817. Later it was translated also into Romanian. And the next code practically in this region comes from Serbia, which was at that moment also subject to the Ottoman Empire in 1844. And this code is also inspired by the Austrian civil code, and practically it's a shortened version of the Austrian civil code, and it was prepared during the fights between the two dynasties. It was commissioned by an Obrenović and adopted by a Karađorđević, so both ruling dynasties in 19th century Serbia had something to do with this civil code. Meanwhile, let's have a look also in Hungary. in Hungary, the customary law was in force, and in this period, some started to argue in favor of codification of private law, and actually, in 1840, commercial law started to be codified with several acts adopted by the parliament at that time. So this happened maybe in very short, in the first half of the 19th century. Second half of the 19th century is a period when models are taken, and also in an effort to modernize. And we should mention, for example, the case of Romania, which in 1864 practically took the French code and with influence of the Italian Pisanelli project and also some on mortgage law, the Belgian legislation created a new code. This is the code from 1864, which was actually enforced until 2011. So this code has a long life in case of Romania. But also we should mention, it's very interesting piece of legislation in 1888. It's not well known, but it should be studied. It's practically a code which was enacted in Montenegro, and the author was a law professor in Odessa, is Baltazar Bogisic, and he took a very interesting approach to codification, researched customary law, and tried to found the text of the code on customs, and develop also and modify if there is a need for, but to have a code rooted in customary law. So this is a very interesting experiment, not well known. First World War and fundamental changes, the age of empires is gone, and new states were created. A very complex situation. The interwar period can be seen as a quest for legal unification in the most of the states which were created after the collapse of empires. Let's take some examples. For example, Poland. In Poland, there was territories under German, Austrian, French, Russian, and Hungarian legislation. That was the case of Poland. Or the case of the newly created Czechoslovakia. Part was under Austrian origin legislation. The Czech part, the Slovak part was under Hungarian origin legislation. The situation of Romania, it's even much more complex, because 6 different private law regimes were in force after the creation of the practically present-day Romania. That was the already mentioned Civil Code from 1864, which was of French origin. But beside this, 5 other regimes were in force. Let's enumerate at least them. Let's start with the most exotic one in the south, in southeast, in Dobroja and in the quadrilateral area. Practically the Muslim law was in force for certain issues. But going back to the mainstream legal systems, in the part of Moldova, Russian and Byzantine law was enforced at that time. Even the hexabiblos, for example, was for a very short time after the First World War applicable. The territory of the present-day Bukovina, which came from Austria, had in force the Austrian Civil Code. The territories gained from Hungary had actually 2 legal systems, because one part was under the customary law of Hungary. Other parts, the inner Transylvania, was under the Austrian Civil Code. So there are two legal systems in that case. So it's very interesting that in this period, Romania had the Austrian Civil Code in force in two of its territories, but not the same code. Because the Bukovina part, which came from Austria, had the Austrian Civil Code in force in its form of 1980. And the Transylvanian part had the Austrian Civil Code in a different form, Austrian text till 1867, and after that all the Hungarian changes. So practically two versions of the same code were in force in parallel. So this period was characterized by a quest for unification. All these newly created states wanted to unify the legislation to cancel these particular legal regimes, and this was a huge effort, and we can say that due to the lack of time, it does not really succeed. In case of Poland, a code of law on obligations was adopted, but not a full code. There was no time to adopt the full code. Also, in the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, Yugoslavia from 1929, codification efforts started mainly based on the Austrian code, but that was not finalized. In case of Romania, a full text of the code was prepared and even adopted in 1940, but it was not entered into force due to the Second World War. So practically, there was a quest for unification, but not really succeeded. In case of Hungary, also very interesting project based on customary law in many aspects was prepared for 1928, but that was also not adopted. Practically, that was the fifth text of civil code not adopted in Hungary. And this is due to also that very strangely, this was the only territory which was without a civil code, because customary law proved to be very, very strong. And the customary law, interestingly, was very fit to be modernized. And courts practically in crisis periods, for example, after the First World War or during the great economic crisis between 1929 and 1933, practically created a very interesting crisis private law, and the judges, even the president of the High Court, for example, were against codification. It's very interesting. So during the interwar period, there in Hungary still the customary law was in force in the general private law context. Of course, commercial law was a distinct issue. And also in the case of Hungary, the commercial legislation was a translation of the German text. And for the civil code, the most prominent private lawyer of this period, Benny Grossschmidt, was very against legal transplants and was really against translation. And he heavily criticized the commercial act of Hungary, saying that if we want to know the meaning of this legislation, we have to go to Kiel and Dresden, and that's not okay, because the Hungarian legislation must be interpreted not based on German textbooks, but based on the local legal science and culture. So this is also a factor which practically made codification really harsh in this country. So fourth wave of codification, that's the period of Soviet-type dictatorship. Some states adopted new codes. Let's mention the first one, the Czech code from 1950, which was a very, very ideological and Marxist code, changed later in 1964 to a new code, which was much more an experiment to preserve something from the bourgeois identity as well. And this is the period when the first civil code in Hungary was adopted in 1959, putting aside customary law finally and creating a code which is a code which was in force even after the change of the regime. Poland also 1964 civil code. Very interesting is the case of Yugoslavia, where in 1946 an act practically abolished everything which was in force before. It's a manifestation of legal nihilism, we can say, but also there was a safeguard that which norms which are not contrary to the new social order can be applied until the new legislation is enacted, practically. So most of the old legislation survived, at least for a certain period. And the scope was to create legislation, unitary legislation, but practically what happened is it was contrary. Different pieces, different parts of a civil code were enacted in time. For example, in 1955, the inheritance, 1978, the obligations, 1980, the property regime. So there was no unitary civil code, and this is also the case of the present-day Serbia and also the case of the other successor states of Yugoslavia, Croatia, and Slovenia. So there is no unitary code, but different books are practically comprised in different separate acts. And this opens the question of the fifth way of codification, after the change of the regime, after the end of transition. And in this context, we should mention the Romanian, Czech, and the Hungarian codes. 3 states adopted new civil codes. And we should also mention the case of Croatia and Slovenia, which countries adopted new legislation, not a code, but different separate acts after the creation of the new states. Practically in the region, Serbia is still working on a code. In 2020, a full project was ready, but due to complex political reasons, that is not adopted. Slovenia, I mentioned, and Slovakia. Yes, Slovakia, we should mention that also for several years is an ongoing process of codification, and we will hear later about the case of Slovakia as well. And the case of Poland is similar, no new code. New code still the 1964 code with several modifications in force. Also, there were several commissions to create a new code, but practically they did not succeed. So we have countries in this region with new codes, countries with old codes in force, and practically codification is still happening, or by adoption of new codes, or working towards to adopt a new code, or by adopting new code and amending them. The Hungarian code, for example, was several times amended, sometimes in a contested way or not in according to the intent of the expert bodies who created the code. And also the Romanian code was very recently subject of important change because the Constitutional Court found the system of protection of persons without full capacity inadequate, and a new, much more flexible and complex regime was introduced. So this was a recent big change of the Romanian code. And we can say it was a very short overview, and in other presentations, I am very sure that more details will arise regarding the states analyzed and the states of this region, East Central Europe. Thank you very much.